The remnants of Florence eventually came up here. I got a little
I have you up, and your mic's up, and I'm rolling, so whenever you guys start talking, I'm already rolling.
Okay, when I'm talking, I'm hearing it like a couple of seconds later. I don't know if we could fix that somehow. Hi there. Okay. Is he gonna like ask me a question going into it, or am I just gonna start talking? Okay.
Just tell TJ
Okay.
that, I finished with Bertha and it went up to Providence. Speaking of which, I don't know. No. I can talk to TJ now? Hey,
can hear
TJ.
you. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm going to spiel about Bertha, and I finished with the track going over Providence, Rhode Island. And so they told me to take they told me that they're going to take your Warwick, Rhode Island, Oakland Beach cam. So I guess I'll reference that. I'm going to walk over to a desk and say, joining me right now is TJ Del Santo, who can tell more about, I don't know if you remember Bertha at all in '96. You're probably too young. But we got Sandy and, the remnants of Florence. You're going to talk all about that. And then you'll do your spiel. And then they told me that you asked a couple questions that I'll ask you when we're done. Okay, I got to shut up now.
Okay.
It's all.
Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
I think it's our 4th edition, right? We do it every Wednesday at 8 o'clock. Usually Wes Hohenstein sits in this seat, but Wes has got some well-deserved time off. Good evening. I'm meteorologist Bill Ray, joining you from Raleigh, North Carolina at WNCN. But we've got other guests with us tonight. We've got Bob Jeswald at WRBL in Columbus, Georgia, and TJ Del Santo from WPRI in Providence, Rhode Island. Over the course of the show tonight, we'll be talking to them. I thought it'd be really cool to go up to New England and get their perspective, and also go down to Georgia and see the folks in Georgia got to contend with the Gulf and the Atlantic. So I thought that'd be really cool thing to do. If there's anything you'd like to know or subjects you'd like us to talk about in the coming weeks, please reach out on our Facebook or Twitter page. Our digital teams here are monitoring questions, and they're going to let me know if you got a question, or let Bob know, or let TJ know. You can go into my Facebook page, Bill Ray Weather, or you can go to TJ Del Santo on Twitter, or B. Jeswald at WRBL on Twitter for WRBL if you want to talk to Bob and ask a question, and we'll try to get those answered, because we'd like to hear what you want to hear too. But we're going to start tonight by tracking the tropics. And much like the last 3 shows, we got nothing in the Atlantic, as a matter of fact. Let's show you here what's going on the big board. Not much. There's no organized activity going on in the Gulf of Mexico. I'll slide this way. We're trying to roll and share tonight to see how that works. See a few showers and storms coming off Mexico, the Yucatan, but nothing organized. This is kind of cool. You get the daytime heating in the peninsula of Florida, and you wonder why they're the most lightning state in the country. You'll see the showers and storms fire up there right on the peninsula from the onshore flow of both the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. Speaking of Gulf of Mexico, let's move down into the Caribbean, and once again, things look pretty good there. But as we go into the Atlantic, this is the intertropical convergence zone, and you see some showers and storms off Guinea here in Africa coming up, but nothing organized. By the way, we showed this last week, and I thought it was really cool. We put the dust cloud on here. You can see all the Sahara dust coming off, and it's still showing up in this area, and especially off the coast of Africa. And we were studying that last week, saying that sometimes that dust can keep the formation of storms down. So we'll see if that holds. But all in all, we've got some showers and storms coming off the coast of Africa, but not much. There's not anything expected for the next 5 days at least. We go to the Pacific, though. I got something to show you. This X right here marks the spot of a disturbance the Hurricane Center is watching. And in this area right here, they're thinking there's about an 80% chance that could form into a hurricane or a tropical system within the next 5 days. And so that looks like that is definitely going to happen. You see all the showers and thunderstorms there as that continues to move toward the northwest. But look behind me. This is a hurricane. We told you we have one out there, Hurricane Barbara, and we'll take a different view of it. Look at the eye. It's so well defined. They said this is the first time they've had a strong storm of Barbara's strength as a B storm in the Pacific Ocean since they started keeping records of that since 1971. So Barbara's a pretty nice looking storm. Fortunately, there's no land around Barbara, so it's the kind of storm we like. As we look at it here, winds are 140 miles per hour. It's moving northwest at 12 right now. This is the Baja Peninsula of California, of Mexico and California. So it's well out in the ocean. And the winds are pretty strong there. As we mentioned, that is a Category 4 storm. But as we look at the track, it's going to be 115 mile per hour winds Thursday, go down to tropical storm force on Friday and Saturday, which is really good news because as I slide the chair this way, this low pressure remnant is getting close to the Hawaiian Islands. So they'll probably see some rain from it, but they're not going to get too concerned about a major hurricane heading toward Hawaii. It's very rare, although they had that threat the last couple of years. So Hurricane Barbara is continuing to move to the west-northwest, and it's something to talk about, but it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So since we're in the Pacific and things are going on, we've had Alvin, we've had Barbara. That area I showed you would be Cosme. I think that's how you pronounce it. Not 100% sure, but Cosme. I think of Kramer in Cosmos, or the guy Kramer in Seinfeld when I see that. But Cosme would be that next system. We go back to the Atlantic. Now, we've had Andrea. That was before May 21st, and did a little research, and we haven't had any named systems. We're still waiting on Barry since the 22nd of May before the season started, and we showed you that we're not going to see any through at least the first week in July. We haven't had that happen here with no storms in the Atlantic during that period of June and first part of July since 2009. So we're definitely starting out kind of slow. We're waiting on Barry. It'll come eventually. As we look at the chart here, you can see where are we right now. We continue to move down the chart, but see how low it is? It continues in July. Well, we'll get really concerned about, obviously, as we head into October, August, September, and October when the season peaks. So we still have a long way to go. We don't want to count our chickens yet. But where do the July breeding grounds occur for tropical storms and hurricanes? Well, first of all, number one, same place they were in June, in the Gulf of Mexico. You don't get strong ones here, but they do occur. And when they do, they usually move up along the Florida Panhandle into the upper Gulf Coast, or they curve out into Mexico or Old Mexico. So that's spot one. Spot number two is in the Western Caribbean. You know what? If one forms here, they usually move right into the Gulf of Mexico, where that other area was. They very rarely go to the east or to the west into Mexico or Belize. They go into the Gulf of Mexico. There is an area that we get concerned about, at least in the southeastern United States, north of the Bahamas. This area right here is a prime spot for possible formation. Once again, not of major hurricanes, but some that could develop in July, and they could hit the Carolinas, or sometimes they do develop, and we watch them stay harmlessly out to sea between Cape Hatteras, and also that's the island of Bermuda there. But there's a fourth area that's been added. Those are the areas that we had in June. This area right here is new to July, and when they form in July here, that's when you can get the stronger hurricanes, and they'd be coming off the moisture off the coast of Africa. This is what can happen. It's rare in July. This is where we get the big ones usually in August and September, but when they do occur, they can continue to move toward the northwest. And as I mention that, I think back to 1996, Hurricane Bertha. This is the path of Bertha right through the islands west of the Bahamas and then slamming into North Carolina in July. So we had a July storm. I remember it well. It was right after the 4th of July. It was on July 5th. This storm formed, and that fourth area I talked about in the middle of the Atlantic, came across the Virgin Islands, dumped a lot of rain there, stayed north of Puerto Rico, intensified to about 115-mile-per-hour winds when it was east of the Bahamas, as that was the strongest it was, and then it kind of missed the Bahamas, and even though it didn't hit Florida, people were killed in the surf from high surf, and we know that is a problem. But look where it went. It made a bullseye for the state of North Carolina. And on July 12th, this storm came ashore between Wrightsville Beach and Topsail Island. And that island right there has been eroding for a long time. And it took some houses and destroyed several houses, took away the beachfront, and those houses were never rebuilt from Hurricane Bertha. And then, you know, months later, Fran came almost in the same spot there, although it curved over the triangle. But this storm went over eastern North Carolina. 12 deaths were attributed to it, not in North Carolina, but the entire storm. $335 million worth of damage between July 15th and July 18th. Now, it came ashore on July 12th in North Carolina, but look, it went up through New Jersey, New York, and into New England before it went and died out over in up in Greenland. But these storms do go to the northeast in Providence, Rhode Island. That's one of the reasons I wanted to get a perspective from the northeast. So we want to show you a camera right now how beautiful it can be. I know it didn't look like this. It didn't look like this when Hurricane Bertha came through in '96, but this is Warwick, Rhode Island, Oakland Beach. And joining me right now is TJ Del Santo from our sister station, WPRI, in Oakland. And there you are. Hey, TJ. Talk about, I don't know, you're probably too young to remember Hurricane Bertha in '96. I wasn't, but if you remember that storm, I know 3 to 5 inches of rain in Rhode Island. And then, of course, you guys had Sandy, and then you had the remnants of Florence and Michael last year. So the hurricanes do affect you a lot, right?
Yeah, that's what we tend to get. We tend to get a lot of remnant-type systems that work their way into our area, but we're not susceptible to big storms that do come up here. Now, I remember Florence vividly last year, and I hate to say this, we had beautiful weather while Hurricane Florence was down there in South Carolina and North Carolina, but it was the reason that we had that nice weather that Florence was kind of guided into the Carolinas, and that was an area of high pressure that was parked overhead and just gave us beautiful weather. But eventually, you're right, Florence did move over New England. It gave some areas as much as an inch of rain or so, but it was moving pretty quickly by the time it was coming up here. And that's one thing that saves us up here in southern New England is the jet stream. It takes whatever is left from a tropical system and usually will send it out pretty quickly, usually, but not always. And of course, Michael came up here as remnants as well, got absorbed by a frontal system and gave us over 2 inches of rain in some spots, but no major impacts to us here in southern New England. But we have had some systems that were a little bit more memorable for us here in New England more recently. And the first was Irene. Now, Irene was back in 2011, which I know affected the Carolinas and came up here and brought persistent tropical storm force winds from a southeast direction. Now, our trees are not weathered for southeast winds, and thousands of trees came down. Our trees are weathered more for northeasterly winds and westerly winds, but so many trees came down with this one because of that persistent southeasterly wind blowing a tropical storm force, along with utility poles and power lines. 300,000 electric customers in the state of Rhode Island were without power. Well, that's basically the entire state of Rhode Island, and many had no power for up to a week. Now, we got a little bit of rain, but in northern New England, they had catastrophic flooding. Vermont had many roads and bridges washed out from the flooding. And a little bit more recently, Sandy. Sandy was a big deal here in southern New England. It kind of sideswiped us. We were concerned about Sandy coming up here, especially with the major computer models diverging on their solutions. The European computer model, a week out, had Sandy going into New Jersey, and the American GFS sending it out to sea. So we were thinking that it's possible that Sandy may split the uprights and come right into southern New England. Now, we all know what eventually happened. It made landfall in New Jersey. Large waves and a storm surge battered our south coast from Newport to Westerly. Major damage was reported. 107,000 customers lost power in Rhode Island as a result of Sandy. So not as much of a statewide problem Sandy was compared to Irene when we lost 300,000 electric customers customers. They lost their power, but still it was devastating to Rhode Island and Massachusetts nonetheless.
Yeah, so Superstorm, I mean, that's what we called it, Superstorm Sandy. You said it sideswiped Rhode Island. What kind of impact, though, did the storm actually have in Rhode Island and Connecticut?
Well, it was we had a small aquarium in Newport right on the beach that was just basically destroyed. All the exhibits in the aquarium were destroyed. Boulders were tossed into a local restaurant in Narragansett. And Westerly, really, they bore the brunt of it. A small section of Westerly called Mesquamaket, famous, a lot of Hollywood actors actually come into the Mesquamaket section of Westerly for vacation. And they really bore the brunt of it with the storm surge that in some cases were as far as a half-mile inland. I remember going down to Mesquamaket in the days after Sandy hit and seeing the water line feet up onto some people's houses as far as a quarter-mile inland. And now they're just about fully recovered, but a lot of people are still rebuilding down there. They're actually putting their houses up on stilts, which I know has been something that's been ongoing up and down the East Coast to become more coastal resilient. But they're still doing that down there, of course, with some federal assistance. But yeah, Westerly got hit especially hard from Sandy. And actually, it wasn't just Rhode Island. It was Massachusetts, south coast of Mass, all the way into Connecticut that kind of got sideswiped by Sandy.
All right, now, you know, up to the north, you don't think of the, you mentioned the strong hurricanes hitting you, although you had hurricanes. How do you keep people prepared up there and make them realize that, hey, even though I live up in New England and I don't live down on Florida's coast or North Carolina's coast, we still have to be concerned about hurricane season?
That's right. Hurricanes are not just a Florida thing. They're not a Carolina thing or a Texas thing. It's actually a New England thing as well, and we have had many storms that have affected us. Now, it's been almost 30 years since we have actually had a hurricane in Rhode Island. And of course, that was Hurricane Bob in 1991. It was very impactful, but it was nothing like the hurricanes of 1938 and 1954. Of course, the hurricane of 38, also known as the Long Island Express, caused widespread devastation here in southern New England. Of course, you think back in 1938, 1954, we didn't have the technology back then. We couldn't warn people to get out of the way, but still that kind of destruction would likely still take place today, even with some of the coastal resiliency that's been ongoing. There would still be a tremendous amount of damage. So it's really about warning people that Sandy, as bad as it was only kind of a prelude what could really come. Sandy brought a lot of big waves and, of course, the storm surge into southern New England and some wind, but that was pretty much it. Irene brought a lot of wind and a little bit of rain, but we haven't had a hurricane that brought all those big ingredients like freshwater flooding, storm surge, and winds of 100, 120 miles an hour all in one wallop. We haven't had that in a long time. The last Cat 3 was 54 in Hurricane Carol. So it's been a long time. There have been generations since we've had a storm that could completely destroy, especially coastal southern New England. So that's what we're doing here nowadays. We're warning people ahead of time, reminding them that it's not if we're going to get another storm, but it's just a matter of when. It could be this year, it could be 20 years from now. We don't really know. Technology hasn't quite caught up with long-term hurricane forecasting, but this year could be a little bit quieter than normal, but it really just takes one storm. Andrew hit on a very quiet year. Bob, which hit us here in southern New England, also hit on a quiet year.
Yeah, that's what I tell folks every time we have to give out the forecast from the Hurricane Center or from NC State or Colorado State, that they give you the numbers, but it really only takes one storm. And I remember Andrew was on a year where it was a very low year. You would say, hey, that year had hardly any storms, yet Andrew occurred. So you're right, it only takes one.
It's one of the most devastating storms in U.S. history.
All right, TJ, thank you very much. I love that perspective from New England. Good talking to you. And you talked about maybe a quiet year. So what we want to talk about is El Nino and La Nina. Now, let's explain that for a second. It's the ocean water temperatures in the Pacific. And I found this graph last week, and I thought it was pretty cool. It was put out the end of June. And basically, if you see this zero line right here, that's normal seawater temperature. And when it gets warmer than that by over 1/2 degree, they call that El Nino. When it's colder than that, it's La Nina. So this is where it's been Let me get out of the way. Well, let me turn around there. Never put your back to the camera. This is where it's been observed in El Nino. And usually when you have El Nino, that can shear the tops of hurricanes off, so the forecasts are usually less. This is the forecast projection. And down, you don't see it on the board here because it got cut off, but there are 3-month rotations. And I think this one right here is the forecast for August, September, and October, where they think El Nino would be. And you can see they range from being a strong El Nino to one lone one that's down here, still not La Nina at the time, but a little weaker and nondescript. But most of them keep at least a weak El Nino going, and that would mean, and once again, we always say it only takes one storm, but that would mean that we should have a below normal year, hopefully, if El Nino keeps going. These are the departure from normal seawater temperatures. This was January. Watch how this darkens into more orange, and that's the El Nino setting up. So when it sets up, it tends to change the jet stream a little bit and shear the storms that try to develop coming off the coast of Africa, and that's why sometimes we say the season will be a little lower than normal. So that's the forecast there. But we want to bring things back to the United States again. Columbus, Georgia here. You know, Georgia's interesting because they don't border the Gulf of Mexico, but, you know, Florida's pretty narrow right there. So they have to worry about the Gulf Coast, and they also have to worry about the East Coast. And we want to show you a nice picture, speaking of the East Coast, of Tybee Island right now. We're looking at a live shot, I think, going to their beach. Once again, very, very beautiful there. And joining me right now, good friend of mine, Bob Jeswald, the meteorologist at WRBL in Columbus. Bob, you've been around the block like I have. I know you remember Bertha, but talk about a perspective from the Georgia side of you of hurricane season where you got to watch both the Atlantic and the Gulf.
It's interesting. The tropical Atlantic Gulf Stream is one that when we see that, we don't get so terribly concerned. Even the outer winds on the west side of the eye wall not necessarily project the severe weather that we can have. I heard TJ talking about Andrew, and of course we were here with Andrew, and that hit Louisiana parishes after hitting South Florida first, of course. And then it was game on, the third strongest Cat 5 hurricane out of 4 Cat 5s that hit the nation's mainland. And then, of course, this year, Andrea, we were talking a little bit about that. You know, there's a live picture you're seeing now. You guys were showing, of course, the coastal areas of Georgia. You remember Matthew, of course, that was a bad deal. But then we look at that as being, okay, for us, a little sigh of relief. It's when something develops in the early season, like Andrea, which was offshore, was in the Atlantic this year, but Alberto and others came in just last year in 2018, Memorial Day weekend, and it created some other issues. But the story obviously was what happens when we start looking over in areas outside the Azores and getting into the Lesser Antilles. Well, Irma's track, when it came through, had everybody watching, had us concerned when it was traveling, obviously, through areas of 2017 here, all the way up through parts of the southeast. And Irma's track certainly was one that we won't forget. And a couple of them that we're looking at that impacted us earlier. And again, if they're offshore, like Matthew was, generally not a big deal. But when they come in a little earlier, even as a tropical depression early in the season, and we were talking about Alberto that happened, as you can see here, May 25 of 2018. It came over in the trajectory here, and when it did come through, sure, it was a tropical storm, had everybody concerned, and it was now putting us on the east side of the eye wall. So for us, even as a depression and long-standing for time across central Alabama, our residents there had lost tremendous amount of power, and that east eye wall brought up the tornado watches and warnings that we were concerned about, and it actually ended up weakening thanks to some weather conditions that weren't suitable for seeing some of these enhanced outer bands to be strong enough. And, of course, you don't need thunderstorms to have tornadoes here in the Deep South. And a lot of times it's not the case. They're weak spin-up tornadoes without any thunder or any kind of convective type storm like a thunderstorm. So Irma took its little path, of course, when we get back to 2017 here, that ended up parking itself a little bit closer to home. In fact, it came too close for comfort. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. And it came right through smack dab in the middle of the News 3 viewing area. The whole east central Alabama was under the gun. We were in a state of emergency at this point. We were prepping. And the main effects of this were pretty strong indeed. In fact, it created so many power outages from a slow-moving depression at this time. And, of course, we know that Irma, it wasn't the strongest ever. And the 4 top Cat 5s that we ever had, the Labor Day of 35, 69 Camille, which is New Orleans coast, it didn't affect us. Andrew missed us. And, of course, we saw how we dodged that in Georgia. But Michael, and I was working in all these, was the one last year that really had everybody concerned about because being the first major hurricane ever recorded in the the state of Georgia and portions of Alabama, did some destructive damage as a major hurricane. Major from all the way from a 3 all the way to a Saffir-Simpson 4 and 5, actually. So we were looking at this, and of course Michael was 155-mile-per-hour winds and weakened into that, but did some tremendous amount of damage. Now, let me show you some of the damage. We'll take you to Columbus, where that path was to the south and east of us. We'll start with Michael first here. And the Irma damage, obviously, when it came through back in 2017, did a lot of this. And I heard TJ talking about how trees and winds, for us, it's the drought years we've had here in the Deep South. In fact, we are the new desert of the United States. Unlike the Mojave or Sonoran deserts in Arizona and southern Nevada and California, we're beginning to see it set up in 07. And those drought years really stressed out the tree roots. So here comes Opal in 95 doing something similar to this. To 07, we get another drought year, and then a 500-year flood in 09. And then, bam, winds that are sustained at 30 to 35 at this point of Irma when it came through, just slowly moved through, was churning all day long. So sustained winds kept at a 20 to 35 mile per hour wind ratio will stress trees to the point where they will topple over, and even occasionally tornadoes. But interesting, we didn't have the tornado threat like you guys had in the Carolinas, because that was such a broad outer band wall, and the eye wall was so large opposed to Michael, which was so concentric. And, of course, speaking of which, some of the other damage we had in Sumter County, we showed you that, and Russell County and East Central Alabama did the same thing. I mean, roots, trees snapped, and so on and so forth through here, as you can see, is very common for us inland like this. And tornadoes were not a big deal, but the winds were. Check this out here. Listen to that wind. Imagine that for hours on end. And eventually trees topple on power lines, so the power grid was obviously impacted. Power grids are shutting down because that's an emergency that they put in there. Parts of Alabama Power and parts of Georgia and Diverse and Tallapoosa power companies here have safety measures. So many people without even water for days and weeks, actually, in Harris County, due to the fact that we had so many power outages that rely on power to pump the water out of the ground. So we were in areas, too, that we were looking at in Barber County, damage that we had from Michael. And Michael, we're going more south and east now of Columbus, where it was so concentric. The eye wall, as you could see, was so tightly wound that we didn't have any impact this far north where you're seeing me stand. It was our southeast counties, and it was that east side of the eye wall. So coming through portions, just a little bit of Florida, and obviously coming into the Florida, Georgia, Alabama line, and then cutting across our Barber counties here, going into areas of minor damage in Columbus only, but Eufaula, Alabama. We've seen roofs that had damage. We had many trees toppled over. Here's some nighttime video. Check this out of rain that was coming horizontal here, as if you were on the coast, and had many people frightened. But this is, again, 45 miles away, and yet we had nothing here. So we always watch at the size of the eye wall, and it'll come in so many shapes and sizes, and that certainly impacted us, although we were fully prepared. But it ended up being only a portion of the viewing area, which obviously did a lot of damage in that case. So, again, the last couple years have been really big for us. You talked about El Nino. We talked about La Nina. We look at the upwelling of cold, rich water over in parts of South America and off the coast of Peru. And once we start seeing that set up with warmer water and a more sluggish pattern, because the ocean waters behave the same way as atmosphere. If you got more cold water piling up at the top of the surface, hey, we're kind of breathing a sigh of relief, less El Nino impacts. But from the Bahamas conference that we gleaned in 2009, when I was there, we had a really good debate on what's going on. Environmental change was introduced and many other factors. But the good science split right up the middle came back and was sound. And when it said, sure, El Nino, you need those sea surface temperatures warm. You need a sluggish pattern and La Nina is going to be more vigorous and have that cool, more high pressure setting up and less chances. But it's the upper level winds are not suitable. So the northern polar vortex oscillation we're looking at now, how many of these upper level winds do not support coastal hurricanes or getting this close from the tropical Atlantic or the Gulf of Mexico or Caribbean? So we watch all that, and hopefully from what you're saying earlier, Bill, we're talking about some of the reports and maybe areas of North Carolina suspecting, hey, this would be good if we don't have a real busy year. But again, let's go back to Andrew in 1992. One storm, the first named storm in October, and I was here for that, ended up being a Cat 5. And in fact, it was the third Category 5 that ever hit the U.S. at 165 miles per hour, and it just devastated South Florida. And again, from that, we learned a lot.
Yeah, we did. When you do your forecasting, how more confident are you these years, as you've gone through the years of being able to warn everybody that they shouldn't be worried? Like, there's Michael, a Category 5 storm that basically missed Columbus, Georgia in a way, but could have devastated it if the track was a little more to the west.
We were really on edge with that. In fact, when, of course, when we're looking at it, it could have been anywhere. Look, the Cat 4, this is from some projections from NHC, but actually, obviously, we all know now it was a Cat 5 when Matthew made landfall. And that being, 2018 Michael 155-mile-per-hour winds became the strongest one to hit the Florida and then end up seeing areas of Georgia, still a major hurricane when it was a Cat 3 and then a 2 and then it downgraded. But it could have been devastating here. More populated areas, a lot of plains here in Georgia. We call it the Georgia Plains. And these areas here are certainly more flood prone. And obviously the trees are very stressed. We saw a lot of that going on. But had it been more populated, it would have had a greater impact. And certainly we really were surprised. I mean, this was a big surprise last year what happened. And, of course, Matthew off the Outer Banks of Georgia, just talk to those people. They're still from Jekyll Island. I mean, they've cleaned up a lot, and off the Florida coastal areas and the outer barrier islands became something more that people were like shaking their heads saying, that too could have been a problem. But we are never that confident. And I guess what we should say is that, look at Irma. Irma was nothing like what we thought. In fact, I'll go back to that again. Irma's track started over here, and we originally thought it was going to be on the east coast of Georgia, which had us breathing a sigh of relief, saying, okay, well, hey, the east side, we're not on it, but those outer bands are going to carry quite a punch, and we were concerned about possibility of seeing these becoming hurricane force, and in some cases, that intense, because when you're dealing with a Cat 5, that's what you're talking about. But by the time it came through the Caribbean, now nobody knows what's going on. It slows down and wreaking havoc over similar places, and then hugging the eastern part of Florida, and we're talking about the peninsula before it gets to the Big Bend and the Panhandle, and then we're like, okay, what is going on here? And now we see it arcing more towards our area. And then at that point, the preparation in our company, which was well done, we had great coordination with all our stations, including you and Tampa and parts of Mobile and our Savannah stations, all coming together in Birmingham and saying, hey, what are we going to do collectively as meteorologists to make sure we watch this and have our preparations in place to get the word out? And at that point, again, and the surprise was that, hey, this thing's a depression, but what can a depression do? And you saw the video earlier. It was a power and tree destroyer, and it doesn't take much wind, is what I'm saying.
No, well, we learned that last year with Florence, just coming over as a Category 1 and then moving at a snail's pace. So it's always something new every year. We learn something new every year. Thank you very much, Mr. Jeswald. Bob, good to talk to you. And may
good
you have a quiet,
Bill. As always, be safe.
All right, may you have a quiet hurricane season in Georgia like we hope to have here in North Carolina. Thanks for joining us tonight online, a little digital for you. And don't forget, we're going to be here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. So even though it's quiet now, as we go through the year, whenever we get a storm out there, we'll be able to detail it and go up and down the East Coast with all the meteorologists and talk about it so we can get you informed and stay in touch. So thanks for spending part of your night with us. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm meteorologist Bill Wright. We're going to leave you with a nice little shot of our North Carolina beach. We've taken you to Rhode Island and Georgia. How about North Carolina as we look at Atlantic Beach for you? That's a nice shot right there. Have a good night, everybody.